Wilson.
My lady, the next witness is Kate Bell.
If you could repeat after me, please. I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and
nothing but the truth.
nothing but the truth.
Please sit down.
Ms Bell, you've provided a statement to this module of the inquiry dated the 15th of July 2025 with reference number INQ 000587945. Is that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
It is.
Thank you. You're giving evidence today in your capacity as the Assistant General Secretary of the Trades Union Congress, a role which you held during the pandemic alongside your role as the head of the Rights, International, Social and Economic Affairs Department in the TUC. Is that right?
I wasn't actually the Assistant General Secretary during the pandemic, but I was head of our Rights, International, Social and Economics Department.
Thank you. And it's right, isn't it, the TUC represent 5 million members across 48 affiliated unions, and as a core participant in this module are working in partnership with your organisations across the devolved administrations.
That is right. Since we wrote the statement, we're 47 unions now.
Oh, thank you. I want to start by asking you, please, about joint working with the United Kingdom government, please. How did you go about representing your members and engaging with the UK government?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here today. So we made frequent representations to government, and I will say in this area of economic support, I think it was our most positive area of engagement. We published reports at the start of the pandemic, and we'd been focusing on sick pay, but also calls for a wage subsidy scheme. We published a report on the 18th of March, which set out what we believe to be a comprehensive response to the pandemic. We sent that to government, and we very rapidly began engaging with the Treasury. So there was a call with the Chancellor on the 18th of March. That was followed with engagement with both the Chancellor and officials, a round table the next day with ourselves and business organisations. And that engagement continued on this particular issue throughout the pandemic. So we were speaking to our members. We held regular executive meetings to hear from our affiliated unions about the experience of their members, supplemented by calls. And we reflected that both by publishing a series of reports which set out what we believed needed to happen, and sharing those findings with government, both with officials and at a political level. And as the witness statement set out, that included a number of roundtables with the Chancellor and our affiliated unions.
Because am I right in that there was no established framework for partnership working prior to the pandemic? So a lot of this positive engagement you've described was really in response to the crisis on an ad hoc basis, is that right?
Yes, I think that's definitely right.
But I think it's described in your statement as a very intense period of engagement.
Was a very intense period of engagement. It was very welcome engagement. We had frequent meetings with officials, frequent meetings with our own unions. I remarked to a colleague earlier that I was reviewing my pandemic notebooks and trying to work out where one day went into the next, because there were so many pages in each day of notes of the engagement we were having at this point.
You suggest in your statement any future scheme or engagement should be via a tripartite panel. So given what you describe as very positive, albeit ad hoc engagement at the start of the pandemic, why does this need to be formalised in your view?
Well, I think we need to be ready for any future pandemic. And I think, and I can go on to say more about this if you want, that the results of our engagement were really positive. I think it would have been easier for everybody if such a structure had already existed before we went into the pandemic, because although, as I said, the engagement was positive, it was ad hoc and people were kind of working at pace, let's say, to get those forms of engagement established. If it's helpful now, I can go on to say why I think that engagement was so valuable and
of course, yep,
what it produced. I mean, I do think there were a number of areas where that engagement with unions as the voice of workers really made a difference to the type of support that was provided. One of those was the relatively generous level of coverage of the furlough scheme at 80%. We'd shown evidence from across European countries which showed that that level of support was possible, deliverable and worked. I think we were one of the first people to raise the issue of about a month and a half into the scheme that people were needing to make statutory redundancy notifications because the scheme was due to come to an end, and the real need to extend the scheme to prevent that from happening. We were also one of the organisations that pushed really hard for the creation of flexible furlough. I think that was also being raised by business, but again, showing the real value of that tripartite engagement. The inclusion of 0 hours contract workers, multiple times where we pushed for clear guidance for parents and those who are shielding. Again, that was on an ad hoc basis. It was due in some ways to the goodwill of officials and indeed the ministers they were working to, but a regular structure for engagement would have made it easier to make those points known.
And I think
I'd ask you to slow down.
Sorry.
going back to the beginning of the coronavirus job retention scheme, your organisation called for a wage subsidy scheme right at the outset, didn't you?
We did. I think the first time, we should check this against the witness statement, but I think the first time was when my colleague Paul Novak, who was then the Deputy General Secretary, gave evidence to a select committee, and we press released the need for a wage subsidy scheme. We then, as I mentioned, had a report out on the 18th of March, which called for that as our central demand for the economic response to the pandemic.
And I just want to take you and all of us back to when that scheme was announced, if I can. If I can have on screen, please, INQ 000656362. This was an email from Rain Newton-Smith from the Confederation of British Industry to Dr. Tim Loynig, who we'll hear from shortly. Now, you weren't included in this chain, but it stated there, in real-time response to the furlough announcement, it has saved jobs in real time. We've had members on the phone in tears. I'm not saying all of the problems are fixed, but immediate reaction from some of the very big employers is positive. Did you have a similarly powerful positive reaction from your members?
Absolutely. We'd been hearing prior to the announcement of the scheme from big manufacturers in the automotive sector about the very real risk of redundancies, people being, at real threat of being laid off immediately. And I think all of our members are quite well networked with other organisations across Europe where these schemes are positive. So we knew that this was something that could work. We knew it was something that was important. And I think our press release at the time was very warmly welcomed the announcement of the scheme. And I think there was a hugely positive response.
Yes, I think your press release described it as a breakthrough.
Yeah.
Right. And indeed, you've reflected on the scheme in your statement and you've described it as the most successful scheme in the pandemic. Is that right?
I think that's right. We know it saved millions of jobs. That's what the evidence says, millions of jobs and millions of people's livelihoods.
And notwithstanding that success, I think there are some design features of the scheme which you would like to see refined or addressed in any future iteration. Is that right?
I think that's right. I can outline them if that's helpful now.
If you could outline the ones which would be priority for you, Ms Bell, please.
I think, and maybe we can go on to talk about this when we talk about the self-employment income support scheme, but the gaps between people who fell between the two schemes were really very difficult, particularly with relevance to people when it comes to the CJRS, people who are on multiple contracts, so had no single employer who would furlough them. That's a particular issue with this scheme. Maybe two other issues which we highlighted throughout and would want addressed in the design of any future scheme. We believe very strongly that people on the minimum wage should receive all of their wages protected, not have that drop down to 80% of their wages. We think the minimum wage is what it says on the tin. It's a minimum. You should be paid for your work, and we thought that was really important. The other issue I think we'd highlight, and I think there were some efforts made in this direction but could have been more, was the provision of some form of training, proactive approaches to people being able to receive training while they were on furlough, so that they could be refreshing their skills to return to their job, or if their job did disappear, they would have a better chance of moving on to the next one.
Because as I understand it, workers could receive training even though they were furloughed, is that right?
They could receive training, but we were pushing for a kind of cross-government effort to make sources of information about training possible, potentially for a duty on employers to tell their workers that they could be trained and to help with the sourcing of that training and potentially to identify the skills that they needed for their business to support employers with gaining those.
Do you think it was widely understood amongst employers that they could offer training to their employees whilst furloughing them?
I don't think so. It was something we continued to raise and our members continued to raise throughout.
Thank you. Another gap which we heard about last week was in respect of employees who were denied furlough by their employers, and so they were effectively left at risk of redundancy. Was that a concern which your members raised with you or which you saw at the time?
We did repeatedly hear concerns about people who were not able to get furlough. I think at times we thought about issues like writing to employers, encouraging them to make sure they were making use of the scheme where they could. We tried to make efforts to make sure that the guidance was as clear as it could possibly be about who could be furloughed. I think I mentioned before, particularly around parents with specific caring responsibilities and those who were shielding. So we were making efforts, our unions were making efforts to make sure that workers and their employers understood that this was a scheme that could be used to protect their jobs.
One amendment or potential solution we heard last week was about a right to request furlough. Is that something which your organisation would support?
I think it's something we could definitely consider. And again, we've talked about that tripartite engagement in terms of with unions and businesses. I think there's some situations, again, particularly for those shielding, where that would be really important. So I think we'd have to think through carefully how it would fit with the fact that it's sort of the business that triggers the furlough and, of course, with the range of other rights that workers do have.
Can I move now to ask you about how the CJRS was extended? And can I bring up on screen, please, INQ 000 612 664? This is a letter to Mr Sunak of the 24th of April 20. And in the second paragraph there, it followed a very recent amendment to the furlough scheme, which you considered to be at the last possible minute. And in the end, of the final sentence there, you're noting a period of consultation around possible redundancies, such that any extension would need to be issued to around the 17th of May. So, as I understand it, you had concerns there around the timing of the previous amendment. Is that right?
That's right. That's the point I was raising earlier about the statutory period for redundancy consultation, meaning I think we raised it and 2 days later it was amended, but it was very close to the point at which otherwise employers would have had to be sending letters to people telling them you are at risk of redundancy, and that would have been very, very difficult for those workers. Again, maybe just going back to the point you made at the beginning about formal processes for engagement. perhaps if we had had those formal tripartite processes for engagement, that might have been a point we would have been able to raise earlier, recognising that, of course, these were pretty exceptional times we were operating in.
And what you were asking government there really was to take into account other labour market laws and rules around redundancy, and so the reality with which employees were operating.
Exactly that.
And it also furthered the objective of furlough, which was, of course, to avoid large-scale redundancies.
Yes.
Do you think the later extensions of furlough took that into account?
I think the point about redundancy consultations had been made, and when furlough was extended that summer, I think that point had landed. I think the period between, I think, June and October of that year, I think there was probably, including amongst ourselves, excessive optimism about what might happen next. So we at that point had called for the introduction of a different type of short-time working scheme. And then the decision to extend furlough in November, I think, was taken very much at the last minute when it became clear that lockdown was going to come back, basically. That did have real impacts. You can see a spike in redundancy notifications in the September, prior when people thought that furlough was going to end. And I think maybe the desire for the pandemic to come to an end and the desire for furlough to come to an end. And I think to some extent there was a real concern among some areas of the media and potentially within government that furlough should not be extended. May have slowed down the realisation that actually what needed to happen at that point was the furlough scheme just needed to be reinitiated because the lockdown was going to be back in place. I think maybe another reflection, and maybe it's easier to have this in hindsight, is some clearer criteria about the situations in which a furlough scheme would apply or be triggered would have helped with that decision making and would have provided greater certainty to businesses and to workers during that period.
So you would like to see in any future pandemic a clear basis on which a government might withdraw or extend furlough?
I think so. We can't anticipate the scenario for any future pandemic, but I think a sort of initial set of guidelines about the situations in which this type of scheme is sensible, possible, and desirable to deliver would really help with decision making in that regard.
Moving now to the decision in March 21 to bring the scheme to an end, and it was brought to an end at the end of September 21. Your organisation called for it to continue longer than that until the end of 21. Why was that?
I think we'd learnt from that period of uncertainty I just described and the importance of providing greater certainty to business. We pointed out, and I think it's in our evidence, that France and Germany had done the same thing. And I think we also knew, or thought we knew by that point, that businesses were not using furlough if they didn't need to. So we were pointing to evidence, for example, in the construction industry, that at the beginning of the pandemic, a large proportion of the workforce had been furloughed. By that point, people had found safer ways of working, ways to operate, and the number of people on furlough had dramatically reduced. So our perspective was it's better to be safe in this respect, and the disadvantages of extending furlough seemed to us to be outweighed by the advantages of that certainty.
Thank you. Can I move now to ask you about the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme, or the Self-Employed Scheme, if we can call it that. On the 23rd of March 20, you called for greater support for the self-employed, didn't you? I think we can just bring this up. It's INQ 000 612 684. This is part of your report, which I think you've touched on earlier, called Fixing the Safety Net. And so what you're asking for there is for the government's support to the more than 5 million self-employed people who at that point were not eligible for the government's job retention scheme. And later on in the report, you suggested the most effective way to support the self-employed would be to bring in a scheme which mirrored the support to the employed, so a support of 80% of income up to a maximum of £2,500 a month. Now, some of the evidence we've received suggests that there was a moral rather than an economic case for supporting the self-employed. What's your view on that?
I don't think we considered it in those terms. We had received calls from our members as soon as the CJRS was announced. I think we had calls from our members representing self-employed workers who were talking about the impact on those workers and, of course, their businesses. Obviously, you know, the situation is different for self-employed workers, although we should note that many of those workers may not necessarily be self-employed by choice. They will have been required to work under those arrangements by the people who are contracting them. So I think it's difficult to draw the boundaries sometimes between the self-employed and the employed. And I think that's one of the cases we were making, is there would be many people in that situation who had no other choice about how to protect their livelihood, and we needed a scheme that would protect them.
Can I move now to ask you about some of the design features of the scheme? And again, although you welcomed the self-employed scheme and the additional support it gave to those who qualified, I think you've identified some coverage issues which you would like to see addressed in any future iteration of the scheme.
That's right. And I think, you know, this was always going to be a difficult scheme to design, and there may always have been sort of edge issues about people who fell either side of those gaps. But I think 4 issues we were raising. One was that not quite in self-employment, not quite an employment group, for example, with multiple PAYE engagements, who were kind of neither one or the other. The well-known issues about those people who didn't have a tax return of the relevant year. Those who were kind of just over the border, the £50,000 cut-off, again, really tricky to design that taper, but over time we thought maybe that could have been addressed. And of course, some particularly difficult issues around people who received their income through dividends. Again, I think those were difficult design issues. They were hampered by kind of lack of data and government information, which was difficult to solve. But again, I think that makes the case for early engagement with a range of different stakeholders in thinking how you would prepare for a future pandemic. I think maybe just the other point maybe I would like to raise, if that's okay here, is one of the reasons that these kind of exclusions were so sharp is because of the inadequacy of other forms of social security or other forms of support. So in other countries, if you lost your job and were not eligible for other forms of support, you might have been getting around 80% of your previous wages anyway through the social security system. But our particularly mean social security system meant the consequences of falling outside between the gaps in these schemes or outside one of the boundaries that this scheme had set were really devastating for people. And you see that in our evidence where you see half of BEC2 members, so they were members in the creative industry, saying they're having to borrow money to make ends meet.
Thank you. The final scheme I want to ask you about is the Kickstart scheme. So this was the scheme designed to support jobs placements for 16 to 24-year-olds on universal credit, announced in July 20 and went live in September 20. You've commented in your statement that the scheme was underwhelming in its delivery, and you've raised some concerns around the quality of training. Can you just elaborate on those issues, please?
Yes, of course. I think I should say in the first instance that it was a welcome scheme. we'd called for that scheme, and we published a report calling for a jobs guarantee scheme because we were very clear about the terrible experience young people were having in the pandemic. They were most likely to be in the sectors which were affected by job losses, and of course much less likely to have savings, and most likely to be scarred by the impacts of unemployment. So the existence of the scheme was very welcome, and when we look at the evaluation of it, we can see that it did deliver positive results, and there were, I think, over 160,000 people who benefited from that scheme. However, I think our ability to engage with the scheme or the willingness of government to engage with us on the scheme diminished a little bit through the course of the pandemic. And one of the issues we'd consistently raised was the need for some more local coordination in how the scheme was delivered. So we asked for local or regional panels bringing together union representatives, business representatives, and Job Centre Plus, who were the main body responsible for delivering the scheme, to really coordinate on how those placements were delivered, who was getting them, the type of additional support that young people with additional needs might require. And that wasn't really something that was ever taken up. As far as I know, that suggestion seemed a little bit to fall on deaf ears. And we think that kind of local level of coordination might have helped with some of the kind of teething problems the scheme faced, some of the concerns that you can see in the evaluation from some young people, although the majority did have a positive experience about the quality of their placements and the training they were receiving.
Thank you, Ms Bell. We've touched on a number of reflections and recommendations throughout your evidence, but there's just one point I want to touch on from your statement. You ask the inquiry to consider recommending a permanent furlough scheme to deal with the future periods of economic turbulence caused by a future pandemic. Why a permanent scheme rather than, for example, an off-the-shelf coronavirus job retention scheme?
I'm not sure there's a huge difference between those two. I think you can see that in countries which already had schemes up and running or short-time working schemes available, it was easier for them to adapt those schemes. And I think some of the issues we've talked about kind of when you pull the lever to have your furlough scheme or short-time working scheme in place are made much easier if you've got a scheme which is already existing, which has a set of criteria which you may need to adapt in the circumstances of a pandemic, but you've got shared agreement, maybe some of that tripartite agreement as well, unions, businesses, government, about how such schemes work and then how they can be adapted to the particular circumstances of a pandemic. We obviously also don't know that the next crisis we face will be a pandemic. And I think we can think of other situations in which a scheme like this might have real benefits. Flooding might be an example where there's a short-term temporary interruption to business, and such a scheme, once again, as we saw with this scheme, can protect jobs, livelihoods and businesses.
Thank you. Those are all my questions. Are there any additional reflections or lessons learned you'd like to share?
I suppose we had kind of 4 points, most I think of which I've made, but I think it is really important to remember these schemes really worked. They did save jobs across the country, they did save businesses, and they did really protect people's livelihoods. And I think we should be collectively proud of that. I think they really showed the benefit of engagement. I've talked about how that engagement could be improved, but workers' voices were able to make a difference to that scheme, as were businesses. I've just talked about the importance of thinking now about any future scheme and what conditions we would want. And that would also help us think about the kind of data requirements we might face and getting ahead of some of those data requirements that, for example, made some of the self-employed scheme difficult to manage. And then I think I would want to reiterate that point that the gaps in the kind of UK's overall safety net made all of the choices about these schemes much harder, because it meant that if you fell through the cracks, you were falling a long way, and that shouldn't have been the case now, and it shouldn't be the case in the future either.
Thank you, Ms Bell.
Thank you very much, Ms Susan. Thank you very much indeed, Ms Bell. I'm extremely grateful to you. You've given a lot of help to the inquiry already, I know, in various models. I know the team's here helping us in M10 as well, so I'm not sure that I can say
Not me.
thank you and goodbye. But thank you very much indeed for all the help you've given so far.
Thank you so much for listening to us.
Mr. Wright.
Yes, my lady. The next witness is Dr. Tim Loynig.
I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall
I'm
give.
sorry, can we start? I'm really sorry to be picky. Can you take hands out of your pockets while taking the oath of affirmation? Sorry.
Apologies.
I'm sorry, it's how I was brought up. Blame the people who taught me.
Can I start again?
Yeah, please. Really sorry.
I do solemnly,
Sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, please sit down.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
That's fine.
Dr. Loynig, you've provided a statement to this module of the inquiry, which is INQ 00588231. But before I ask you some questions arising from your statement, I think you've drawn to the inquiry's attention two short corrections. So can we deal with those at the outset? And there will be a further short statement formally addressing them. But I understand the two corrections are that at paragraph 434 of your statement, where you reference R below 0, the reference should have been R below 1, is that right?
Correct.
And at paragraph 555 of your statement, the reference to 110 million should be to 110 billion.
Embarrassingly, but yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That presages me asking you that you are were the economic advisor to the Chancellor at the time of the pandemic. Is that right?
That is right.
Yes. Thank you very much. Dr. Loynig, your background has been in economics throughout your working life as an academic and practicing economist. Is that right?
Yes.
And you then found yourself working in government at different times, including at this time as an advisor to the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Yes.
Thank you. I want to ask you, first of all, about the coronavirus job retention scheme. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of that scheme, I would like you to assist the inquiry, if you could, with understanding, in a wider sense, where a scheme like that sits in terms of economic response, what it is it's intended to do, if we can examine that for a moment, and to look at what other options may have been available, policy options in this sort of situation. Should we think about the job retention scheme as a labour market scheme, a scheme that's designed to support the labour market, or is it an income support scheme? How would you term it? How should we think about it?
Well, it's many things simultaneously. The point of a furlough scheme, and they exist in just about every European country, is indeed manyfold. As you say, one aspect is simply to replace income, but that's not the primary intent.
Can I pause there? because otherwise I'll be told off. We're going too quickly.
I'm sorry.
No, it's not your fault, it's mine, because I need to just slow things down a little bit. It's because a note's being taken, so just take it a little bit more slowly if you wouldn't mind.
So one of the objectives, aims, outcomes, call it what you will, of a furlough scheme is income protection. But that's not its primary aim.
All right, so can we just pause there?
Yep.
Just to unpack this for anyone listening. Income protection, so that's what, the protection of the income of the worker?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And we can see that in continental Europe, where they have, as Kate Bell, your previous witness from the TUC has said, much more generous welfare schemes, but they also have furlough schemes. And there, the aim is explicitly really not to protect the incomes of the workers because they are protected by other things. Rather, the primary aim of a CJRS-style scheme is to maintain that link between workers and their employers. And that reduces the risk that workers will drop out of the labour market altogether. I remember shortly before, or roughly the time, Topshop went bankrupt. And I remember an interview on the BBC with one woman who said she hadn't applied for a job in 30 years, she didn't know how to begin, and she thought she might just quit. If we'd have had mass redundancies at the time caused by COVID, there would have been other people like that who would have chosen or felt they were forced to choose never to work again. And that's bad for those individuals, it's bad for their income, it's bad for their mental health, it's bad for national income, and therefore it's bad for public services because we get less taxes.
So just pausing there. So a scheme like the CJRS scheme, it supports the income of employees, and relative to the amount of money that was available in terms of income support through benefits, through universal credit, at a higher level. So for those who are furloughed, their income is relatively better protected than it would be if they were forced or required to claim benefits.
Yes, that would absolutely be the case. And of course, being placed on furlough doesn't preclude you from claiming universal credit. Universal credit is a benefit available to people in work as well as those out of work.
To top up their income.
Yes.
Right. But it preserves a match, does it, between the member of staff and the
employer.
Business?
Absolutely. That also makes it much easier for a business to reopen. If we imagine that tomorrow this building was shut down and everybody was made redundant, it would take some time to rehire people and get them trained up so that the business of running this building could function effectively. But with a furlough scheme, you just recall them, and by and large they all return, and then you can reopen. And you can also be confident of that for all of your supply chain. So the example I give in my evidence is the cafe can be confident that it can hire its staff, but it can also be confident that the pastries will arrive because the company producing the pastries will have rehired their staff. And therefore the economy can restart much more quickly than if everybody is made redundant and firms have to start from ground zero.
So taking your example, it means that when the economy can restart, the pastry chef is still matched to the job making pastries, and the barrister, not barrister, but the barrister is still matched to the coffee shop where he makes the coffee.
Correct.
She makes the coffee.
And that's better than them having to find a pastry chef from scratch, having many applicants, some of whom, frankly, don't know a shoe bun from he demonstrates he knows nothing about shoe buns or pastries from another form of pastry, and should not be hired or would not be as good at it were they to be hired. So the economy can start much more effectively. And that's really critical when you're going to reopen an economy, because you want to be able to reopen the economy and boom. It's what was called a V-shaped recovery at the time. Those are very rare in general economics, but a furlough scheme makes them much more likely.
So it's not just matching skills to jobs. It has another advantage, which is it's about the speed of recovery.
Absolutely.
You turn the tap back on.
Yes.
And people can come back to work straight away.
Absolutely.
And that applies all the way through the supply chain.
Yes.
Okay.
And it also gives people a lot of hope. Because if you're sitting at home but you're furloughed, you are furloughed in the reasonably confident expectation, particularly once your firm is having to pay a proportion of your salary, that as soon as they can reopen, they will want to rehire you. Whereas if you've been made redundant, you might think, hey, I'm a good worker, someone's going to want to hire me, but you don't have any evidence of that. So it's an altogether better proposition to be furloughed in terms of mental health, in terms of confidence in the future.
Okay. And in terms of the Treasury's response to this emergency, is it fair to say that the majority of the support, certainly in pounds, shillings and pence terms and in terms of workers, was through this job matching scheme and income support delivered in that way?
I'd have to check that, but I doubt it's true. I think when you add up the SAYs, the grants to local authorities, the reopening grants to business, and the losses on the loans, I'd be very surprised if the furlough scheme was a majority. Very surprised. But I haven't done that test.
In terms of support for jobs, furlough was at the heart of that.
Yes.
Right.
But we should also remember that a reopening grant to a firm is also support for jobs as well, indirectly. So it would depend on how you classify things.
All right.
But it was indeed the principal labour market intervention.
And you've explained the benefits of that
Yep.
labour market intervention. But before we look at those benefits and whether they apply in all economic emergencies and all economic circumstances, can we just touch on alternatives?
Yep.
There wasn't presumably a sense in which the only thing the government could have done was introduce a job retention scheme.
Oh, no, there are lots of things the government could have done, including absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
If this had happened 100 or 150 years ago, there is no doubt the government would have done absolutely nothing, because that was an era of laissez-faire where governments were absolutely willing to say unemployment, as Keynes wrote, unemployment is the lot of man. Each generation must take its fair share without grumbling. We are not in that world anymore, for sure.
But that was an option,
Yes.
albeit one that...
I don't think it was ever
obviously
considered by
discounted.
either the Treasury.
Exactly.
Just for the record, I'm not saying we ever
No.
considered doing absolutely nothing
No.
and tolerating 4 million people becoming unemployed.
No. Now, another approach, maybe an approach more like the approach taken in the United States of America, that I think you've described as the helicopter money approach.
Yep.
Is that right?
That's the standard economic description of it.
Yeah. Just explain to somebody who doesn't
Yeah.
understand anything about economics what that means.
So the idea is that to keep jobs going, you simply give everybody a lot of money, they spend the money, people get employed. And so the idea is a helicopter goes over, literally dropping £10 notes. Now, of course, nobody's literally suggesting a helicopter goes over and drops £10 notes. The usual way it's done is to give every individual or household a sum of money. And if we work out arithmetically what that would mean in this case, because I did the numbers in advance, that would have been the amount of money we spent on the furlough, net of tax, because it's important to remember the furlough was taxable. And actually, a lot of the money came back immediately through income tax and national insurance, and later through the contributions from firms. So the net cost to government was 26 billion, which equates to about £520 as a tax-free gift to any individual, to every adult in Britain. So we could instead have given everybody £520. However, to do that at the beginning would have required us to know how long the crisis was going to go on for. So more likely we might have given out a couple of £100 in March 2020 and then another 100 or 150 in the autumn and so on. And it seems unlikely that giving you £200 in March 2020, or bluntly, I do not know your income, but I'm willing to bet that £200 is a very small proportion of your annual income, and it wouldn't really have led you to spend £200 more at that point. So what we know is that the problem with helicopter money is a lot of people just save it, especially in a context where you cannot go out to dinner, you can't go to the theatre, you can't go on holiday. There are so many can'ts during COVID that helicopter money really would have been an ineffective way of doing something.
And is it just that I can't spend the money, or is it also that in a time when the country is frightened about the future, does not know what's going to happen or when, it's not just I'd spend it if I could, it's that I don't want to spend it, I want to keep it in case I need it, because I don't know when I'm going to go back to work, when I'm going to have a job, when I'm going to have income.
So there are many reasons why people's propensity to consume, as we say in economics, falls. It fell during COVID. A lot of that money would have been saved, and therefore it would not have been effective. But even had it been...
Just
yes.
I don't want to cut you off from saying anything important, and forgive me if my questions sometimes disrupt your flow, but I just want to pick things up as you're dealing with them. Under the helicopter money approach, is there not also a sense in which you'd be giving out money to a lot of people who didn't need it?
Yes.
Because you'd be delivering the £520 per adult in the United Kingdom to people who had no need for any money at all.
Oh, absolutely. It would have been absurd had I been given £520. And as I say, I don't wish to pry into your circumstances 5 years ago, but I suspect it would have been absurd to give you £520 as well.
Yes, I'm getting a bit nervous. It's always coming back to my
Yes.
circumstances, Dr. Loyning. So let's move on from me as the exemplar, shall we?
I'll pick on you next.
I wonder when that was going.
Inevitable. So, I mean, that's one of the problems. You're giving out money to everybody. There's no targeting where it's needed. And if you compare that helicopter money approach, which, unless you have the data, requires you to give it to everybody, does it already feel much less targeted than a job retention scheme, which is giving it to those who can't work?
100%. And we shouldn't forget the only country that used helicopter money was the country that didn't have a PAYE system that is a requirement to run a furlough scheme.
Yeah.
So in a sense, it's almost pointless to ask me about a scheme that no one in their right mind would choose. And we know empirically that no country that had the choice chose to use helicopter money rather than a furlough scheme. The only people who used helicopter money were people who couldn't run a furlough scheme.
No. And I appreciate that's your view about it.
No, that's an empirical fact.
That it's pointless me asking you about it.
Sorry.
But this is an opportunity for you to explain why the Treasury took the approach that it did. So the country you're referring to is the United States.
Yes.
And even if the United States had wanted to have a job matching scheme, a job retention scheme, they don't have a PAYE tax system, is that right?
Correct.
They wouldn't have known who employed who.
Correct.
They wouldn't have been able to deliver the support.
Correct.
And so they were starting from a basis where they couldn't do it even if they'd wanted to.
Oh, absolutely. They had not a chance of doing it.
Yeah.
And hence, when Bernie Sanders called for the British furlough scheme to be copied in the United States, there were some wry smiles in the Treasury because we knew that was impossible for them.
And so is that why you say any sort of comparison between, well, the Americans did it this way and we should have thought about doing that? They did it that way because they couldn't do it any other way.
Indeed.
And what are, I mean, we've touched on some of them. Are there any other downsides to doing it the way the Americans did it, as far as you're concerned?
Well, it would not have overcome the ability to reopen quickly because many of those people would have been made redundant. Anyone working in a restaurant would almost certainly have been made redundant under the American model because the employer would not have had any income to fund them. It would almost certainly have overloaded the welfare system, which is a problem we saw in the US. The US welfare system is much more complicated than ours because it's delivered at local level. But if we had have seen 4 million people lose their jobs, even if they'd have got other jobs a month or 6 weeks later, there'd have been a lot more universal credit claims to the point where it seems unlikely the system would have coped.
Just pausing there, we heard some evidence last week about the uptick in universal credit claims in the early days of the pandemic, over 1 million extra claims, and that number of claims, it was said in evidence last week, risked knocking over the entire system. So if we had been talking about a situation where there had been many more millions of claims, your view was that was also undeliverable.
Well, that was the advice we got from DWP. Now, I'm not a computer programmer. I know nothing about the scalability of UC, but DWP's advice was that if 4 million new claims came along in a month, that was, curtains for the system. And that's understandable. You can look up the number of people who usually claim, and you might say we need a margin of error 10 or 20 times bigger. It would have been bizarre for the British government to have specified a system with, a 1,000 multiple sort of margin. That would have been not a good use of taxpayers' money whenever UC was created.
So there were other things that theoretically could be done if you take the view you need to do something. But you've explained the downsides of helicopter money. Were there any other viable alternatives other than helicopter money and furlough?
Well, it depends what we mean by viable. As I say, in the 19th century, we would have just done nothing. Yeah. People would have lost their jobs. They'd have lost their livelihoods. They would have been seen in the street in the way that the Victorian era was quite famous for.
Yeah. But if you accept the argument that government had to do something,
then I
other than
can
those
think of
two,
no other.
No. One of the... Yes, I'm sorry, I'm being told to ask you to slow down again.
Ah, yes. Well, wave that little thing at me, and then I'll know what it means. That'll be helpful.
Yeah, well, I'll just keep telling you to slow down, all right? Let's try and do that if we can. On the subject of the helicopter money approach, and I asked you about the fact you'd end up giving money to lots of people who didn't need it under that approach. Can I just pick up on one issue about data, and we'll come back to data, I'm sure, during your evidence. But we've heard from a number of witnesses about the lack of data for this or that. But one issue that's emerged through a number of witnesses about a sort of household data set. So a set of data that will enable the centre to actually understand something about the need of individual households, the financial need in a time of crisis. Do you, first of all, think it would be a good idea to build the capability to establish that sort of data set? Secondly, do you think it's feasible?
So the first thing you'd have to do is define what a household is, because a household has many different meanings. A decade ago, my household was quite straightforward. It was my wife and I and our daughter. It's still my wife and I and our daughter, but she's now an adult. Are we one household, or are we? She's a working adult. Are we one household, or are we two households? If she then moves out and moves in a flat share, are they one household, or are they two households? I believe Facebook used to have the relationship status, it's complicated. And that's certainly true for anybody trying to devise a database based on households. So my biggest concern about it is we simply don't have an agreed definition of what a household is that is universal and covers all the myriad of different living arrangements we have. The second issue we have is how we would keep up to date who is living with whom. There is no requirement in Britain to tell the state where you live. It's hard to believe that we could keep that up to date. So it depends what you mean by a database. A database that is good enough on balance to inform policy, I think that is relatively straightforward. A database that is strong enough to actually allow for operational decisions, such as giving £520 to every household, I think that's way harder. And I would defer to experts at the ONS and elsewhere on whether that was possible to do. But I admit, as an economist rather than a data expert, I am not convinced that's an easy thing to do.
So the more data you can gather that will enable analysis to inform policy, good thing.
Yes.
But you doubt whether you can ever gather enough data to actually deliver support through that data in a joined-up way.
I doubt it would be politically feasible. So I recollect that DWP, if they're deciding whether two people live together as a couple, look at things like where is their toothbrush in the bathroom? Do they share a single tube of toothpaste? Apparently that's, if the DWP inspectors visit you, that's one of the standard tests of are you cohabiting or is this person a lodger? Now, of course, we could look at every single person's bank account to discover if they buy their toothpaste separately. I mean, at a technical level, that might be possible, but I really doubt any politician that says we're going to look at every single person's bank account to discover who buys the toothpaste. I can't see that happening anytime soon.
All right. Can I move on a little in the context of the job retention scheme? Because you've touched on this to a limited extent so far. You've explained why a furlough scheme, or the advantages of a furlough scheme, but there wouldn't be they would not necessarily be advantages in all emergencies. Is that right? Does it depend
Correct.
on the type of economic emergency you're facing as to whether you want to go down the job matching route?
Absolutely. You really want to use a furlough scheme when you think the economy after the emergency will be the same as the economy before.
Right.
So if we go back, and some people in this room will be old enough to remember the 1970s, we had two oil shocks. They were genuine emergencies. I'm just old enough to remember, as a child, queuing with my grandma to buy petrol in about 1979. Because I loved cars, that was quite exciting for me. It was rather boring for my grandmother, and she complained about the cost of petrol, about which I knew nothing. But that sort of crisis that is going to lead to a change in the optimal nature of the economy, a furlough scheme could be very bad news. Because if you've got a company that is shut down because the price of oil is so high they can't make money, well, unless you think the oil price is going to come back down, it's not sensible to furlough all those workers. So there are some crises where a furlough would be the wrong approach. So the question is, do you think the post-crisis economy will be substantively the same in terms of where people will be working? If you do, then a furlough scheme is great. If you don't, then all you're doing is giving people false hope, and that's not going to be helpful.
And so was the Treasury proceeding, were you proceeding and giving your advice to the Chancellor on the basis that this was the sort of emergency where you could broadly expect that the economy would be the same after the emergency
absolutely.
as it was before it?
In March 2020, all the talk was of flattening the curve, sort of banging it on the head to begin with, evening it out to cope with NHS capacity, and then we'd come out the other side having reached herd immunity. And although that phrase is unpopular today, I think it is medically the correct phrase. And at that point, we were thinking 3 or more likely 6 months, we'd be out of it. People would be going back to restaurants, they'd be going on cruise ships, they'd be going to nightclubs, and all those jobs would come back, give or take. Obviously, some firms would go bankrupt along the way, but by and large, yeah, that's what we were expecting. And of course, that is what happened, albeit with a delay.
Yeah, well, I was going to pick up on that. I mean, you factored in another issue here, which is firstly that there was an expectation that the economy would reopen in broadly the same form, but also was there an expectation that this would be a relatively short shock of
Yes.
duration? So is duration of the shock important to furlough? And let me ask it in this
Yes.
way. If it had been expected that there would be a shutdown of society for 5 years, would a furlough scheme have been the right answer?
Well, let's take the extreme case. Let's say it's 20 years, then obviously not. And it's a judgment as to how many years, and it depends how accurately you think your prediction of it rebounding is. It also depends on what you can do with people in the interim. So in a period where we wanted people to stay at home, protect the NHS and save lives, if you want them to stay at home, kind of paying them to stay at home through a furlough scheme might actually be an effective health policy. But would you do it for 5 years? I doubt it. But it really does depend on whether you think they can get another useful job. And that's one of the reasons that I push so hard, and the British furlough scheme is internationally pioneering in that people could get another job along the way. Because we didn't want Tesco ringing us up saying, hey, we've bought thousands of vans, there are thousands of people wanting their shopping delivered, but we can't recruit people for love nor money because they're on furlough. So we want it to be really clear that you had the right to take another job temporarily. And having spoken to the OEC subsequently, they do think that is an interesting variant of furlough that is suitable for a national crisis as opposed to an industry-specific crisis, which is what furloughs are usually used for in Europe.
So this is part of the scheme architecture that
Yes.
allowed a worker who had been furloughed
Yes,
to, if another job presented itself, they could undertake that job
absolutely.
without jeopardising their ability to return to their pre-existing
Absolutely.
employment post-pandemic,
Absolutely.
but also presumably giving them the flexibility to retain that other job if that in fact turned out to be a better job or a job they were more suited to.
Yep.
Yeah. Or equally for people who were furloughed but felt they wanted to make a contribution in other ways, to volunteer in some way towards the national effort.
Absolutely, with the exception that you couldn't volunteer for the firm you worked for, because that creates all sorts of risks of bad behaviour.
Well, I'm just going to pick up on that because
Yep.
we've heard about that this morning, and I just
Yes.
want your explanation for that. This was in the context of the charity sector. Sir Oliver Dowden was explaining that point, that there was a concern within the Treasury that if you allowed people to volunteer within their own job, there could be issues. Would you explain why and what
Yes,
the
well,
concern
we
is?
worried, and I'd be interested to have heard you ask Kate Bell this question, actually, whether the TUC would have been worried about pressure on workers to accept being furloughed and then returning to work voluntarily. And our view was, and I mean, who knows who DMS would have spoke to in the Treasury? You'd really need to ask Beth Russell or the Permanent Secretary this rather than me. But I'm not aware of DCMS raising that with us at the time. And I think our general view was that most people who volunteered could find a similar charity to volunteer for. So if you volunteered in one food bank, if you were paid to work in one food bank, there was almost certainly another neighbouring food bank for which you could volunteer. And indeed, there was nothing to stop two food banks ringing each other up saying, hey, I furloughed this person, hey, I furloughed that person. Why don't we both ask them to volunteer in the other ones? But we really did think it was important to protect workers from bullying bosses, expecting them to turn up and work for a 20% wage cut, or doing something really naughty like saying, if you're furloughed, we guarantee you a bonus of 40%, so you'll be a winner, we'll be a winner, and the poor old taxpayer is a loser.
And the flexibility that you've described in the UK furlough scheme that allowed people to take other jobs, is it your position that that wasn't replicated anywhere else in the world, as far as you're aware?
My understanding is we were the first in the world, and that it was not introduced by any other country during the COVID era, yes.
You've made the point about furlough can go on too long.
Yep.
Or the longer the emergency, the less likely it will be the right policy response. I just want to pick up on that in the context of the UK response and the UK scheme. Where do you stand on the question of whether, looking back, the scheme went on in the UK for too long?
So with the benefit of hindsight, we could easily have ended it 3 months earlier. But that really is with the benefit of hindsight. I mean, you've heard Kate Bell say that the TUC were claiming that we were ending it too early. And they weren't alone in saying that at the time. And the cost of the final 3 months was pretty low. I give some estimates in my evidence of the fiscal benefit of ending it early, and it isn't high. So yes, with the benefit of hindsight, it could have been ended a little earlier, but the savings would have been small. Because the great thing about furlough schemes is they are self-tapering in the main. As soon as the company can reopen, they will resummon their workers because they make a profit out of their workers. Everybody employs someone for a reason. And so as soon as you're allowed to trade, by and large, you will resummon that worker. And therefore, the cost of keeping it going too long is pretty small.
So the furlough scheme almost self-polices
Yes.
because ultimately you work on the basis, do you, that the employer business actually wants to go back to profitability and to start producing widgets again rather than remaining dormant for a longer period of time.
It wants to make and sell pastries. However, there are some favour furloughs that we know are out there. Who you might have a member of staff who you know wants to retire, but they're an old family friend or a small firm, so you leave them on furlough because it costs you nothing. You will get some like that. So if we had a complete blanket open furlough where an employer could furlough anyone, then you would get some furloughs that would last forever. And towards the end, we would have had a high proportion of favour furloughs and the like at the end. And that's why when the scheme ended, we didn't see a rise in unemployment. So that's why you shouldn't simply have a British style furlough system forever. The continental ones have more checks and balances in them.
Were you yourself arguing, actually, that a decision should have been made earlier to announce that furlough would end at a fixed point? There would be a date in the future when it would end?
Well, we agreed in the Treasury in the Easter that it would end that summer. I'd have to go back and check the notes to give you a definitive answer either way on that one.
I mean, what's the advantage of providing that sort of certainty to business, that it's certainty the other way, that support's going to end as opposed to support's going to continue?
Well, at one level, the two are the same thing. I mean, as Kate said, and the TUC was right, they were the first people to tell us that a lot of firms had 45-day notice periods of intention to make people redundant. And 45 days is almost 7 weeks. So it meant that government really should, if they can, be giving businesses 7 weeks notice. That would only give business 2 days to decide whether to make someone redundant. So we therefore need to give people 7 weeks notice. And that's, in that summer, we knew from the previous year that cases were likely to be low, but also that furlough use was going to be low. So it seemed easier, particularly in the experience of the last autumn, to play it safe and add another month or two on. That's my recollection. I'd have to double check the emails to see if that's true, but that's my recollection sitting here today.
Yeah. And we know that an element of tapering was introduced into furlough. Could you just explain to us why that was introduced, what the rationale was?
So the rationale was twofold. Firstly, that we started off with a 100% of cost of furlough being met by the government. We wanted this to be the no-brainer option for firms. because we wanted firms to say to workers, stay at home, your job will come back. You don't want to move house, you want to be in the same place. Just stay at home, protect the NHS and save lives. So it had to be an absolute no-brainer, which it really was. That's why we got the numbers of people furloughed that we did. But over time, what we needed to say to firms is, if you think the world has changed, you shouldn't be able to hold on to workers at absolutely no cost to yourself. We want you to make a...
Sorry, we're just speeding up again a little bit, so
we wanted
slow
to
down
say
a
to
touch.
firms, it's exciting, we wanted to say to firms that if you want to retain this worker, you need to have a little bit of skin in the game. You've got to be saying to the world, yeah, I want to re-employ this person. I'm putting my money where my mouth is. Not too much money, not sums of money we don't think they have or can get hold of, but a little bit of something. And that is the continental model. Now, the continent started the other way. They started with their standard rules of furlough, which involved employer co-payment, but they soon gave up with them. And in a sense, that's the danger of preparing too much in advance. If you think you have a playbook, what you've got is the playbook for the last war, and you have to change it. But because we were writing a new playbook, I actually think our way round was better. No initial co-payment and a later co-payment. And what we discovered is that most firms were absolutely willing to make those co-payments. We did not see jumps in redundancies when they were announced.
I'll just pick up on something you've landed on there, which is planning and playbooks.
Yeah.
We've heard about talk of off-the-shelf schemes and permanent schemes and the like. Dr. Loyney, from your statement, would you say we might be right to detect that you're not a great fan of pre-planning for economic response in the sense of having fixed reactions to events?
You would indeed, very strongly, and I'm glad that came over loud and clear.
Yeah.
And the reason for that came through in what Dr. Bell said 10 minutes ago, when she said there's no difference between having a permanent furlough scheme and an off-the-shelf scheme that we can reach for.
Yeah.
And we've done the furlough scheme once in Britain. We managed to do it in 55 hours, and including inventing it. So if we had to do it again, we could definitely do it in 55 hours. It didn't need statute. It is available to any government in future who wants to reactivate it. So it is there. You can't undo something you've done. So in that sense, whatever we may think of planning, that idea is there for any future government.
But I just want to drill down a little bit into how anti-planning you are. You presumably wouldn't argue against, for example, thinking now about what data would it have been nice to have in the last pandemic.
No,
if we'd
absolutely.
have had better real-time monitoring, then we might have been able to tailor as we went, those sorts of things. So you can plan for your infrastructure, can't you?
Correct.
Right.
Correct. So you can plan to have the right sort of people in post and the right sort of evidence. But I think it is better left to those people with good evidence to make up the plans at the time in the light of the actual facts that are known, not some sort of loose. Because the danger of having plans, I think, was seen on the medical side. We knew we were second best in the world at pandemic preparedness, because the Johns Hopkins international study had told us that. Not only were we second best, we were miles better than the French and the Germans, and many miles better than the Italians. So we were not complacent, I don't think we were, but we were confident we knew what to do when a pandemic hit. And we were wrong. And that's the danger of having a playbook, that even when it's quite closely aligned to what you think you're doing, it is often better to sit down and think, as John Maynard Keynes said, with a fresh, unprejudiced mind.
Okay. Well, let's just break this down. So you can plan for the evidence you think
Yes.
you're going to need, and you support that.
Yes.
So that's data gathering, collection,
And sharing.
and sharing. Would you also agree you can plan for analysis? In other words, you can put in place good analytical capability.
Yes, although you can also hire that in pretty quickly,
Yeah.
whereas you can't create data collection pretty quickly. You pay the right money, people will work for you.
And do you support the idea that there should be centralised cross-government analysis that provides a synthesis of all the underlying data, so it gives people more confidence in their decision-making?
I'm not sure whether it has to be centralised as opposed to decentralised. I certainly wouldn't want to see, say, the Cabinet Office given responsibility for the things that PHE or the Department for Health can do better than the Cabinet Office, or the Cabinet Office to try and do economic analysis better done by HMT or the OBR. So I think we need to be a little bit careful about centralised.
Okay, but you can plan for evidence. Analysis, you say you can stand up. What about planning for delivery architecture? So the infrastructure through which you deliver the scheme. We've talked about universal credit, and we've heard evidence about legacy benefits. The IT was so poor that it would simply not have been able to process an uplift. So can you do that sort of planning in terms of getting your infrastructure right so you can deliver if you choose to do so?
Yes, although the reason why we still have the legacy schemes in DWP is apparently it's very expensive to get things off of mainframe computers. And that's true in the private sector as well. I have a friend who administers pensions for the private sector on a mainframe. He assures me he has a job for life because it's very hard to get the stuff out. So you can plan, but sometimes you just have to accept there are some things that would be very expensive to prepare in advance. You multiply that by the chance of disaster and it's still not worth sorting out. It's better to say, well, we'll have to come up with a workaround when necessary.
All right. But if you can make these corrections now in a cost-effective way, then you should do them. You should get the architecture,
Absolutely.
the nuts and bolts in place.
That is the definition of common sense.
Yeah. And then you can do the free thinking in
Yes.
the context of the future emergency, however it looks.
Yes.
So can I just push you about the off-the-shelf scheme idea? For it or against it? Should there be not a predetermined plan that you will deploy a labour support scheme in a future pandemic, but should there at least be a basic playbook of this is how you do it?
Well, I think there is already that playbook in that we have, partly it's created by you, but the Treasury has its lessons learned, it has its history, etc. So I think there is already that playbook. And Dan York-Smith said last week that the Treasury has a list of people all by their previous jobs. So that if Tom Hemingway is still somewhere in government, as the senior civil servant who held the pen throughout COVID, he will get a phone call from someone saying, hey, Tom, we need to talk to you. And even if he isn't still working in government, so long as he's alive, they will track him down. And I'm not saying that's because they can snoop on him, but you can find most people these days pretty easily. So I'm not sure that you need a playbook that is nicely printed and stamped on the front, playbook. What you need is that collective residual memory. And that's something that Treasury, as a rather, I was going to say inbred, that's a little harsh, but as an organisation that tends to promote from within is actually very strong at. And again, Dan York-Smith talked about that last week as to how he was able to do his job while finishing off on the budget and why he was the right person to do it, because he was the most cross-Treasury person. And that was my experience working with Dan when he and I were colleagues. He was exceptionally good at finding people who knew their arse from their elbow. Knew all sides of the issue.
Yeah, well, that's probably a more politic way of putting it. But anyway, thank you. So have I understood really that what you're saying is corporate memory important, remembering
Yes.
what you did, why you did it and how it went and where the pitfalls were, and you think that's more important than it is to have an off-the-shelf scheme
Oh,
that you
absolutely.
dust off and deploy
Absolutely.
in any situation?
I have no hesitation in agreeing with you entirely and utterly on that one.
Thank you very much. Milady, is that an appropriate moment for
Yes,
a
of course.
break?
We take breaks every so often.
Yes.
And I suspect everyone will be grateful for one. 3:05.
All right.
Mr. Wright.
Thank you very much, Milady. Dr. Loynig, we discussed before the break about this idea that the scheme, the furlough scheme, was to some extent self-policing. Business would want to get people back to work. I'd just like to ask for your observations about one element of the data, which is, I think, slightly odd, relating to furlough in September of 2021. So this is a time when we are thinking about the economy recovering. I'm going to ask if it's put up. I think it's INQ 0000 65758. It's at yeah, there we are. Thank you very much. It's this table which shows us the number of employments on furlough. And we see there September 2021, 108,000, which is A, a significant number, but B, much, much higher than in other months. I mean, do you have any view about that? Given what you've said about the firm will naturally want its employees to come back and will want to start making money again and being productive.
So I'm going to put forward two possibilities, and HMRC could probably tell us whether either are possible. The first is that actually this is employments that have been declared, and some of them are actually earlier. So I mentioned in my evidence that IKEA furloughed staff, but they never claimed the money. So a company might have put people on furlough and just not got round to claiming the money, and suddenly think, oh no, it's about to end, we better claim the money. So it might be that.
Right.
So that we would want to check. Otherwise, it's pretty self-evident that I would say that there's 70,000 people whose furloughs look pretty ropey to me. However, given they're only being furloughed for a month, part of me thinks, would a firm really risk getting sanctions for fraud for stealing what is a very small sum of money, given that it only lasts 1 month? I mean, if you did it the month before, you'd get double the benefit financially for your fraud for probably a similar amount of risk. So that's why I think you'd really need someone from HMRC to tell you exactly how these figures are constructed.
Well, you describe it in your statement as an oddity,
Yes.
this figure, and that's still how it appears to you. Yes. It's odd.
It's odd.
Yeah, all right, OK. Let's move on and to the autumn of 2020, moving on in time. There's a section in your witness statement that you've called, could we have done better in autumn 2020? And I think you'll anticipate that part of my interest in autumn of 2020 is might be described as the U-turn on
Yes.
the extension of the job retention scheme. Let's start with an open question. Could you have done better in autumn of 2020? Did you think?
So, had we known what was going to happen, then clearly we could have done better. But if we go back to what I said before about giving people 7 weeks' notice, that would mean the Treasury would have needed to make the decision 8 weeks before, even assuming we could make the decision in a week. And it took about 10 days for the data to come through. And therefore, the question is, what were the data like 10 weeks beforehand? And at that point, death rates are still falling, and COVID infection rates are incredibly low. And here you have the tension between giving firms notice, which tells you that you should try and do things in advance, which is what we tried to do by announcing the job retention bonus. And as Kate said, again, an hour or so ago, Dr. Bell from the TUC said, they called for the end to furlough that summer. It wasn't quite universal that everyone said you've got to end furlough, but it was absolutely the standard received wisdom. Had we stood up in the summer and said, oh, we're just going to extend the furlough if necessary for another year, we would have been laughed out of court. We had the governor of the Bank of England through to the TUC saying, you need to end furlough. And that's the context.
Right. So,
could we have done it a week before? Yes, probably. I think we did get into a mindset of thinking, we've made a decision, we need to keep going with this. Could we have done it 3 weeks before? Maybe, but that, I think, re-announcing furlough 3 weeks before we did, given where the death rates were at the time, which of course are the 5 weeks before death rate because of the lag in the way the data come through, I think that would have been a pretty punchy statement by the Treasury that we could see a lockdown coming. And I'm not sure that that's the Treasury's job to anticipate a lockdown without a pretty firm steer from Patrick Vallance, Chris Whitty, the Prime Minister, that lockdown is the most likely outcome.
So based on the data that was available to you, at the time when you would have needed to announce the decision to extend, the data would not have supported a decision to extend. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct. And therefore, the 30,000 rise in redundancy notices, I don't think those could have been prevented without the ability to foretell the future. And we should note that although maybe 30,000 more people got a redundancy notice, that doesn't mean they were made redundant. When we look at the data on employment and unemployment throughout that quarter, we don't see a big rise, either shortly before furlough ended after furlough was expected to end or shortly afterwards. So we see a big rise in redundancy notices, but that doesn't mean the person was made redundant.
So I just want to pick up on that. So it's perfectly possible that people were given a notice of redundancy.
Yes.
And then the extension of furlough,
Yes.
when the decision was reversed and it would be extended, meant that those redundancies did not in fact take place and they remained on payroll and in receipt of furlough payments.
That is correct. And HMRC may have the data at firm level that would allow us to find that out for sure. I'm not, to the best of my knowledge, that is a known unknown that could be a known known.
But to your knowledge of the data, you do not see at the time of the decision to extend, the U-turn, we'll call it that.
Yes, it is a U-turn.
For convenience sake, you do not see a significant increase in unemployment figures that corresponds with the redundancy notice figures.
That's correct. There is no such evidence in the data.
But from your perspective, the key point is, based on the available data, at the time the decision was made, and at the time it would have had to have been announced to have removed any of the downsides, the data would not have supported an extension.
Correct.
And just taking that one step further, if it wouldn't have supported an extension, so it was positive looking data relatively, but the messaging of Treasury was perceived to be, we think we need to extend furlough, what would that have an effect? Does the messaging of the Treasury have an effect on confidence, consumer confidence, so on and so forth? Is that important?
Oh, absolutely. Everything the Treasury does is scrutinised. If the Treasury had stood up weeks before, when the numbers were just going up a little bit, and said, oh, we think we're going to need furlough this winter, definitely people would have said, whoa, what do they know? And then they would have said, what is the government not telling us? Whereas actually we'd have just said, oh, well, it's a hunch. We'd have looked, I think, very silly then. And I think the government as a whole would have looked very silly, because the government's mantra was that we are following the science. And as I've said, in reality, that means we were following the scientists. But it really wasn't for Treasury to basically undercut the scientists by announcing a package that implied we would need a lockdown or that COVID was about to spiral out of control.
Right. I'm just going to ask for another document to be put on the screen. This is an email from you on the 10th of September, INQ 000 65 6583. Yeah, and it's at the bottom there, 10th of September, from yourself to Olaf Henriksen Bell, who was who?
Head of press or similar. He might have been the Chancellor's official spokesman, but he was somebody who was very well in touch with public opinion, which is why I was corresponding with him.
So that's the purpose of the email. Or the reason you're sending it to him is because of his knowledge of public opinion.
Well, he was also, he's intelligent. He went on to head the number 10 policy unit. He's a serious thinker. I wouldn't want to speculate 5 years on exactly my reason for sending a particular email.
But I'm just interested in how high
He's a
up
fellow senior colleague. I think we were both directors at the time.
Just interested in how far up the chain you expected this communication to be passed. Is this just office chat, or is it?
Yes, it's office chat.
Right.
I mean, it's chat for a purpose, because I'm thinking about a serious issue here. And as you can see, on that day, I thought that we shouldn't be as keen to get rid of furlough as the Chancellor was. And there were other times around that period where I was not consistent in this period. No. You can find other emails that I sent that said, yes, I think we need to get rid of this. It risks ossifying the economy. It risks preserving further furloughs, etc. But on that day, I was thinking aloud about whether at 1.7 billion by November, a figure, of course, which would not have happened because the lockdown happened, so it wouldn't have been 1.7 billion. I was wondering then about whether we should just stick with that and let it run out in a normal manner.
Was this because the data was starting to show that things were going the other way, or?
No, it was quite the reverse, actually. It was because the data, we were still confident that things were getting better and the furlough cost was coming down. So I was thinking, why are we creating a new scheme? The system is sorting itself out. The economy is rebounding. If I'd have sent this email 6 or 7 months later, it would have been the perfect email to demonstrate my prescience that when the economy reopens, there is no need for a new scheme. Just let the thing run out. And in the context of believing that there was no second wave coming, I sent that email.
Yeah. So this is generally demonstrating you putting into action the thought you've expressed that the scheme is naturally self-policing. It will naturally run itself down as the economy recovers. Therefore, if it's going to do that naturally and the costs will keep on going down and down and down, what's the point in saying we're going to end it on a hard date?
However, the returners bonus was predicated on what a lot of economists told us. This is a period in which people are predicting that unemployment will rise by about 1 million. And 1 million people, although that's a lot lower than the 4 million who would have lost their jobs, 1 million people is a lot of people. And what economists told us is the best way to reduce the number of people who are unemployed is to reduce the inflows into unemployment. That is, to reduce the number of people who lose their jobs. And the returners bonus was a good idea in that context. So what I'm saying in this email, however, is that the returners bonus won't work if it isn't cutting through with firms. And that we invented it with the best of intentions, in line with good economic thinking, but it just wasn't getting the cut through that furlough had or that was necessary to make it work. So in the context of it not getting the cut through that we anticipated, I'm saying, let's take stock and ask ourselves, is it really worth doing, or should we just run out furlough into the winter as COVID dies out? But my belief that COVID was dying out was entirely predicated on my understanding of where the scientists and the medics were in the summer and early autumn.
Okay. Looking back and accepting, hindsight's a wonderful thing, and you didn't have a crystal ball. You've said you don't support planning. Corporate memory is what's important. What does your experience tell you? If we were back in this situation, what would you do differently with furlough, if anything?
So the thing I would do differently is that I would remember that almost all viruses are much worse in winter. And you'll know, because I submitted it, a rather longish paper that I wrote in, I think, August or September, looking at the performance of about 15 different countries at some point early that autumn, showing that some had shot up and some had gone down. And there were any number of emails I sent saying, winter is coming, it will surely be worse. And actually, if there was one thing I wish I'd had tattooed on my increasingly bald forehead at the time, it was winter is coming and it will be worse. And that's a thing I think that we didn't really get in government in the summer or the autumn. And as I say, my reading of that is that the then question is, did that mean we should have loosened up the economy more in summer to increase the number of people who got it then, to reduce the chance of the NHS being overloaded in winter? Or should we have gone hell for leather to make the vaccine available as quickly as possible in November, December? But I think it has to be one or the other. So looking back, that is the thing I wish I had better understood, is the sheer seasonality of this. And in that we could have learned from flu, because flu is tremendously seasonal. Now, I'm not a medic, I'm not an epidemiologist. If Chris Whitty wants to stand next to me and says, Tim, you're flat wrong on this for the following reasons, I will absolutely accept that I'm wrong, because Chris is an epidemiologist and I am not. But that's the thing that, looking back, I really take out of this. Winter hits you very hard.
Yeah, now that's a very high-level reflection about what you did and didn't do in Treasury. But can I move on to more granular issues, design issues about the scheme, just to see whether there's any learning you would take from certain design issues in the scheme. And the first thing I'd like to pick up is whether payments, that is payments to employers, should be in advance or in arrears, and where you stand with that. Tell us, first of all, what the scheme did and whether you agreed with it.
So I definitely agreed with it. I was instrumental in it. The scheme offered payment in advance, but a large number of companies, indeed the vast majority, didn't take it. And that surprised me because I had expected companies with no revenues not to be able to pay payroll and then claim the money back 5 days or 17 days later. And it wasn't clear to me the banks would want to lend a company with absolutely no revenue money for those 5 days, even on the certainty it was coming back. And that's why I pushed very hard for it to be in advance, and I was very impressed that HMRC said they could do enough fraud checks to make that worthwhile.
Okay.
What we then found out, though, is a lot of companies didn't claim it for weeks and weeks and weeks, so we didn't actually know how many people had been furloughed. And as I say, I gave the case of IKEA, which never entered the statistics because they never claimed the money. So I would, in retrospect, say that have some rule that says companies must claim within a month or whatever the standard payroll dates are that HMRC could advise, so that the government knows the fiscal position accurately and knows how many people have been furloughed accurately.
Would there be an advantage then on that basis in saying you must claim in advance?
No.
And just to explain why.
Well, there's no... Well, if
it
they
would at
claim,
least tell you the numbers, wouldn't it?
it would, but whether they claim in advance or 5 days later, those are both good enough. We don't actually need... People always talk about real-time information. As the head of Tesco once pointed out to me, they have no real-time information on what's on the shelf because there's a delay between your taking it off the shelf and it going through the till, and that is just not a problem. You rarely need things that are that up-to-date, and 5 days, a week, 2 weeks, that would have been fine.
So no absolute requirement to claim in advance. Either or remains fine.
Yep.
But you would advocate having a requirement that if a company is going to claim, it has to claim within a certain period of time.
Yes, and that certain period of time should fit with the standard payroll software to make it easy to do. I think they have 19 days from memory, but most companies do it after about 5 days.
Would imposing that requirement also ensure that the scheme was slightly more targeted in the sense that, take IKEA, if they didn't claim, you might conclude that's because they didn't need to.
Oh, I think IKEA would have claimed in those circumstances. They always... somebody senior in IKEA gave an interview with one of the newspapers in which they said, we furloughed people and we expected to claim because we had no revenue. But at the end of the year, we had sold as much furniture, despite only being open half the year, and therefore it felt immoral to claim, even though we had the legal right. So I assume, had they been required to claim, they would have claimed, and then they would have repaid it, which a number of other firms did. And as I say, I think a statue should be erected in their honour, because it is quite something to return substantial sums of money to the government when you have no legal obligation to do so. And I think the fundamental morality of those companies should be recognised.
In your view, is there any way of targeting payments so that those companies who don't actually need the money can't claim it at all?
No. And that's not a feature of furlough schemes in the COVID period in general. And that's the principal reason for that is supply chains. So the example I gave in here was my then vicar's mother, who was a farmer. Now, of course, there was no ban on drinking milk, but restaurants consume... We drink far more milk when we go to restaurants and cafes than we do at home, because people drink all sorts of fancy milk-intensive coffees, and therefore milk consumption goes down when we can't eat out. Her farm happened to have a contract with a supplier that supplied entirely the restaurant chain, and she was told to throw her milk away. She was clearly affected, but there's no way HMRC or HMT could know that this farm is affected and this farm is not. And if you say, well, you can only get the money if you prove your revenue is down, well, that gives firms an incentive to reduce production. And that's a terrible incentive to create in an economy. So we go back to the fundamentals that if John's mum could sell her milk, she would, and she would employ her staff. She has an absolute incentive to employ her staff. But if she can't, then she will claim furlough as a fallback. But her incentives are all under furlough, absolutely correct. If you can make money from your milk, make it. And if you can't, we stand ready to help. But I mean, the idea of a whole bunch of bureaucrats working out which farmer should be in and out, I mean, that is not a world I would want to be in.
What about targeting of furlough only on those sectors that have been closed by NPIs?
But the farm wasn't closed. It's the supply chains that's the issue.
That's why I'm asking you
Yes.
the question. So that
Yes.
you would say that is an answer as to why that sort of targeting is difficult or impossible?
Yeah, it's impossible. It's impossible to do it well. You can do it badly, and if the only alternative is to do it for that or nothing at all, then I would leap at the chance. But whenever generally sensible people said in the press during COVID, you should target the scheme, I would simply email them and say, how? And they would say, you should do closed sectors only. And I say, what about the supply chain? And they'd usually go back and say, And I go, well, let me know when you've come up with a way, but if you wouldn't mind, until you've come up with a way, be grateful if you didn't say this should happen in the press again.
So is part of the power of the scheme and the success of it driven by its universal application? Everybody can claim.
Yes, it is. It's everybody can claim, but nobody has an incentive to claim unless their business is actually affected.
Because otherwise, why wouldn't they want to make money?
Correct.
Right. You do, I think, advocate that one adaptation in any future emergency would be to publish upfront, so at the time of claim, a list of all companies who are making a claim. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. I think that would deter fraud.
And just explain why you think that.
Every single disbursement of government money and every single tax has an element of fraud. It's what's called the tax gap in the literature. And therefore, there were bound to be fraudulent claims, and some of them were exposed in the media. I remember a hairdresser being interviewed who discovered, I don't know how, that she'd been furloughed, which came as something of a surprise to her as she had continued to work throughout the crisis. Now, most hairdressers are small companies, we can imagine if her hairdresser was listed as having furloughed 6 people, she could deduce there were only 8 of them and ask her boss quite what was going on. But better still, her boss would have been deterred from fraudulently claiming furlough for workers. And I think we have an estimate of it's about 5%. That's about typical for tax schemes. But if we can get that 5% down, we can and we should. We owe it to hard-working, law-abiding taxpayers not to give their money to crooks, spivs and others. And that's true in any form of government spending, whether it's buying PPE, the furlough scheme, or how we enforce income tax.
Just so we're clear, there was publication, is that right? But it came in later on.
Yes, it was much later. And I think as a standard thing, any private body getting anything other than individual welfare benefit where there is an expectation of privacy should be recorded. So that goes for CJRS, the self-employed scheme, the grants to shops and so on and so forth. These should all be recorded where there's any optionality. So if everyone gets rates relief, then there's no need to write down the list of everyone. But when there's any element of I have chosen to claim, that should be public.
I think you also suggest that it may be a much smaller effect, but that may also discourage those from furloughing staff who don't really need to, or
Yes.
claiming, not
Absolutely.
in a fraudulent sense,
Yeah.
but just because they don't
Yes.
need to.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I think we've dealt with targeting, Dr. Loynegg, because I could run through lots of different ways of targeting: sector, geography, financial impact, so on and so forth. But should we understand you don't favour any, or is financial impact the potential exception?
Definitely not financial impact. The only one that is possible for future pandemics is a regional one. So the most obvious case here is if there was some disaster in Ireland, could I imagine a furlough scheme entirely for Northern Ireland, where we might look at the supply chain effects and think those are very small on the mainland? Then I could just about imagine it. So regional is the one that I think should not be ruled out categorically in future. But I wouldn't rush to do it even then, because who knows, do we understand the integration of the Northern Ireland economy with the rest of the country sufficiently well to be sure that it shouldn't be done? I doubt it.
Yeah. And that's largely the downside is the supply chain.
Absolutely.
Right. Can I pick up another potential modification of scheme design partial furlough. So a partially furlough an employee, effectively a wage subsidy. Where do you sit on that?
So just to clarify, a wage subsidy is a much more all-embracing term. So I'm going to delete the words wage subsidy from your question and answer the substance. The standard European one does allow a partial furlough. And as you'll know from my original emails, that was my working assumption to begin with. And two things changed my mind. Firstly, this is a medical emergency, and therefore having people coming in having everybody coming in half the week is really quite a bad outcome in terms of stay at home, save lives, protect the NHS. And secondly, the complexity of it. And thirdly, sorry, it's one of those two-part answers that has three, the ability to be fraudulent is much greater with a partial furlough, since if an inspector turned up, you could say, oh yes, well this person is here, but it's their day in the office. Whereas if you only have a full furlough and you see someone is working, especially as they're not allowed to volunteer, then you have a slam dunk element of fraud. So for those reasons, I favoured a full furlough initially, and as Dr. Bell said earlier this afternoon, both they and the CBI pushed for a partial furlough. We created it after a while. It was not used as heavily as I think some of its advocates expected. But yes, it was a worthwhile introduction.
Do you think that there is sense, looking ahead again, in asking employers to register workers before they start work?
Categorically, it will be very useful for two reasons for firms to have to register when they employ someone. The first is simply for government statistical knowledge. It would be useful for the government to know how many people are employed and unemployed at a time and how many people soon will go into those categories. So if the Chancellor at the moment knew how many people had received a redundancy notice and how many people had got a job offer, she would be in a much better position to understand how the economy is doing. And secondly, it would allow us to combat tax fraud, because you could turn up at the moment, somebody can be employed and they'll be paid at the end of the month, and there's no obligation to inform anyone that they're employed. So if you turn up as an inspector to a factory and absolutely nobody who's working there is listed with HMRC, the company can say, well, we just hired them last week. And there's nothing you can do then, even though you're pretty sure that's a cash-in-hand employer. If we said they had to be registered before they started work, then we could clamp down on some really bad firms that are undercutting reasonable firms, distorting competition, and behaving in ways that are just unacceptable in a modern society. So for a variety of reasons, I'm absolutely in favour of that.
Two other scheme design issues. One that we heard from Kate Bell earlier today, minimum wage.
Yep.
So that furlough should not reduce wages below the minimum wage. In other words, if you assume the minimum wage is the minimum that anybody should be paid, then that should be the amount of furlough. Would that, first of all, have had any effect on the success of the scheme in terms of its objectives, its economic objectives?
No, not much. It would have been quite hard to do because the government only knows how much money you're paid per week or per month. It doesn't know your hourly wage. So it would be relatively hard to enforce. So, because obviously not everyone works full time, so you can't deduce what their hourly wage is from their weekly or monthly wage. Secondly, you would then need a taper, because you can't have somebody paid 5 pence above the minimum wage taking a 20% cut and then ending up below the minimum wage. So you would need some sort of complicated taper on furlough that I think would have reduced the clarity of the message. The second reason I don't support it is that almost everybody has some costs associated with going to work that disappear when you're on furlough. So you don't have to pay travel, you don't have to buy a sandwich. There's a bunch of costs that usually come with working. We do, of course, also have universal credit. So if the household, as defined by universal credit, is now in trouble, then universal credit is there to help them. And we shouldn't think that everyone on minimum wage is in a household that is poor. Sometimes they're second earners, sometimes they're third earners. So no, I think the complexity outweighs the benefit of that suggestion. It's one of the few areas in which Dr. Bell and I disagree.
Right. And then one final scheme design element that wasn't a feature of this scheme, and I'd just like your view about it, because we've heard this in evidence last week from Dr. Mike Brewer and supported by others. The idea that an employee should have the right to request being furloughed and a corresponding right to request not to be made to work.
So, of course, everybody in law has the right to ask for anything. You have the right, everybody had the right to go to their boss and say, I would like to be furloughed, and to set out their reasons. What I think they mean is a stronger right, such as the right to go part-time, where your boss can only say no if they can provide a valid reason.
Yes, that's precisely what Dr. Brewer articulated.
It's one that should be considered in the different circumstances, but on balance, I don't think that should be the case. Because I worry, perhaps rightly, perhaps wrongly, that a lot of people who were worried for all sorts of reasons would come forward and say, I am anxious, I'm worried, I have childcare. There are 101 reasons that would have risked quite substantial parts of the economy collapsing. I'd be particularly worried about this in healthcare settings. We know that anybody aged 50 and over was at a heightened risk of death from COVID. And I think it would have been hard to establish when an organisation could say yes or no. Would the NHS, for example, have had to grant furlough to every single member of staff over 50? I think that would have been catastrophic, absolutely catastrophic. And the same is true for other parts of public services. So, on balance, I am not persuaded of that, but I see where they're coming from. It is not a ridiculous suggestion.
Thank you very much. Can we move on then to another major scheme, the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme, which you address in your witness statement from paragraph 599 onwards. Now, this scheme, would you characterise it as purely an income replacement scheme?
Yes, absolutely. And the answer is in the name, right? It's an income support scheme.
Right. And so, does it share any common objectives with the furlough scheme beyond the support?
Not really. So the point of the furlough scheme was that it allowed firms to reopen very quickly. But self-evidently, if I'm self-employed and I have to stop work because of the NPIs, I can return to work in my business at any time I choose. I own that right, in a way that an employee has no right to reclaim their job if they've been made redundant. So in that sense, it doesn't really help with a V-shaped recovery. So no, it really doesn't. It doesn't keep you in touch with the skills you have already, because you have those skills and you can always choose to re-employ yourself. You have that, by definition, that complete agency. So it's very much an income support scheme, and I was very pleased that the titles reflect that. One is a job retention scheme, one is an income support scheme.
You say in your witness statement, I'll just put it to you rather than having it put up on the screen, that since the number of self-employed people is relatively low and unlikely to cause a collapse of that scheme, the rationale for the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme was moral and political rather than economic.
Yes.
And it came with a considerable fiscal cost. Is that your considered opinion about the scheme?
It is.
Yeah. I'm going to ask that we put up a document, please, INQ 000 656603, page 1. And you say there, I've struggled with this one intellectually from the beginning. The aims of furlough were, and then you set them out. Not one of these was achieved by SAYS. Is not needed. I think that's the point you've just made. They can go back to their old job. Nothing to preserve a connection with the labour market. Doesn't compel you to return to work. It's not fair because you say some people got far more than their losses. And then you say, next paragraph, so SAYS was really a generous income support scheme for a politically vocal group. And then underneath that, For what it's worth, I think we should say to the Chancellor, sure, some self-employed people will be doing less than they would like. And you go on. So in terms of that being a good use of public money, that scheme, where do you stand with the scheme?
Well, that's a political question. There was definitely pressure out there. There was an expectation, not just among the self-employed, but in the population as a whole, that if you were self-employed and you couldn't do your job, the state should stand behind you in the way it stood behind employed people. I think, bluntly, had the Chancellor followed my advice, he would have been described in Yes Minister terms as exceptionally brave. Because the self-employed are widely liked, they're respected. Most people will tell you they want more support for the self-employed versus big business. I'm in somewhat of a minority in not sharing that opinion, but it was good that the Chancellor got to see both sides of that. And I provided one side, and there's no doubt that public opinion polling, a sense of what was right and fair, was absolutely not with me. I'm in as I say, a small minority on this one.
Yeah. I'm just interested in the value for money sense.
Yeah.
I'm just going to ask, another email was put up, INQ 000656405, page 1 of that, please. And you say there, self-employed has proven too hard. Our scheme is terrible VFM. Is that value for money?
Value for money, yep.
We are defeated, and that annoys me.
Yep.
Why was it terrible value for money?
Well, because of the reasons in the previous email. I can't remember in which order I wrote those two emails, but the previous email set out the reasons why I did not think SAYS was achieving anything except to give money to a group of people that I couldn't see any moral reason for giving money to. But that's a personal view. We were defeated in that we couldn't come up with a better scheme, and it annoyed me that we couldn't. And it still annoys me. I still haven't come up with a better answer. I still can't improve on those emails I sent, and I still understand why the Chancellor chose to ignore me. I was not with public opinion, and public opinion should be respected in a democracy. Nobody's ever elected me. They did elect him, and they supported him in those decisions that he made. It certainly wasn't a terrible VFM in the sense of a complete waste of money. I never once wrote to the Permanent Secretary and say, I think this is so bad you should require a letter of direction because this is a misuse of public funds. It was perfectly reasonable for the Chancellor to say the employed and the self-employed should, in some loose sense, have the same level of support, and this is the closest we can do.
Was part of your I don't know if hostility is too strong, but your argument against the scheme, that the self-employed had a different tax treatment to the employed in terms of national insurance contributions and so on?
Yes, completely. People who are self-employed, and I myself am both employed and self-employed, and I pay a much higher rate of tax on my income from PAYE employment than I do on my self-employed income. That is the way the system is structured. It's not that I've engaged in any tax planning. That's just the way it is. And I think, by and large, if a group pays less in tax, there should be an expectation that they get less back in benefits. And that was traditionally the reason why the self-employed paid less tax, because they got a lot less support in terms of crisis. They were not able to get sick pay, they were not able to get unemployment benefit, etc. And I felt that should apply here.
And did you raise the argument for tax harmonisation?
Yes.
That might have justified the scheme?
Sorry, I'm not supposed to speak over you. Yes.
And with who and to what effect?
Oh, to all sorts of people and to no effect, both to fellow civil servants and I'm pretty sure to the Chancellor. He certainly knew my view on small firms. Indeed, there were points when I would type into Teams calls, my usual comment applies, and he knew exactly what that meant.
Yeah. And your view was effectively that very often these were people who paid themselves by a mechanism that meant they paid less tax. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
Sorry.
Well,
I'm doing it now, it's catching.
Well, hang on, I want to distinguish between two groups. If you are self-employed, you could set up a company and then employ yourself and pay the maximum amount of tax. That's relatively hard. The group company owner-managers who pay themselves as a dividend rather than as a salary, we didn't bail them out, partly because we couldn't, but there was a feeling that they had positively structured their tax affairs to minimise the amount of tax they paid. And from memory, I think the TUC supported us in that right back in March. And there was some criticism of that, but as I said in that longer email, we rode that one out, and the people who had done that felt they were in a weak position to get public sympathy because they'd clearly structured their accounts to reduce the amount of tax they paid compared to the norm for self-employed people.
If the self-employed income support scheme was designed to provide income support, what was the rationale for not saying to that group of people, claim universal credit?
Well, exactly. Well, I mean, the rationale is that the public expected the self-employed to get similar levels of support to the employed. And that to have said to them, well, claim income support, which many of them would not have been eligible for a penny because they had more than, £16,000 of savings, and they would then be told, you are on your own. That's how the universal credit system works. And as Dr. Bell said an hour or so ago, we need to understand that these decisions were made in the context of a much lower level of welfare support in Britain than in other European countries. I'm not saying that means we should copy Europe, but it does need to be understood in that context.
So does this scheme, in your view, really sit at the boundary between economic policy and social policy brought about by political pressure?
Yes, it's social policy, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it is, in my view, social policy rather than something to help the economy rebound.
Yeah. So as an economist, you would say job retention scheme did do that. Lots of good economic reasons for doing that. But you personally didn't share the view that the self-employed scheme would there was an economic case for it.
You put it very well.
Thank you. Can I pick up, please, moving on, because those are my questions about the self-employed scheme. Data. You've already touched on some elements of data where you think that Treasury would be in a much better position to see the real-time effect on the economy and to respond. Do you have any other thoughts about data collection, either by HMRC or the Treasury, that would enable the Treasury to respond better in a future pandemic or other emergency?
So overall, and then both Dan York-Smith and James Benford said this last week, there was a very low level of trust in government on data and data sharing at the beginning of the pandemic, and that was regrettable. And that happened in very surprising ways. One of my emails that I spotted noted my recording that Highways England had refused to share data with Treasury on how well the roads were used. They claim they had no legal basis to do so. So that's why we had to ring up Google, who told us how the roads were being used. But from the Treasury's point of view, knowing how many people are on the roads is kind of useful if you want to understand whether the lockdown is working. And for Highways England to turn around and say, well, we're not telling you, is just bizarre. I mean, it should be unacceptable. But they said, and they might be right, that they had no legal gateway to share that information. And there's one of my emails in here in which I reply ARG, with a lot of G's and H's, when HMRC declined to share some information with Treasury. And I think that approach is just hopeless, unless it's disclosive of an individual, or could be disclosive of an individual, i.e. it covers a small enough group that one can deduce something about an individual. Government should be willing to share. Government departments should absolutely be mandated to share data with each other. If the Treasury or DHSE wants to know how many people are travelling on different roads in the country from all of those cameras that Highways England have, then Highways England should categorically be required to share that information. Now, I think that has got better since then. I think SALT, the Senior Analytical Leadership Team, which has the Government Chief Scientific Advisor, the Government Chief Economist, the National Statistician, and a couple of others, I think that was created after after COVID, and I would hope that would be able to bang heads together. But even then, there is no general legal right to share data across government. And I would love a one-line bill that says if the Senior Analytical Leadership Team says that data should be shared, then that data, it is legal for that data to be shared within government. I think that would be a helpful recommendation on your part, and it would be helpful if the government did it. More generally, as to what data should be collected, I think it would be useful if the British government, along with other governments, work with the OECD or others to discover what information other countries collect and how they use it. because I can sit down and try and think about ideas from scratch, but we tend to make best progress when we copy other people who are more successful than us. So as I recount in furlough, people sometimes say, oh, you invented furlough. Nope, no. I took the furlough scheme from Germany. We should try and find out what data other countries collect. That doesn't mean we should collect it. In the 19th century, the French agricultural census recorded how many dogs every farm had, and they were divided into 4 categories of dog. It is really not necessary for the British government to collect data on 4 categories of dogs on farms, but it is worthwhile seeing what other countries collect, seeing how it's used, and then thinking, what would be the cost of collecting that here, and would it be useful? So I would prefer an international commission. The ONS has its counterparts in other countries, working with the OECD to give a really definitive answer to that question, rather than my speculations.
Thank you. And then data science capability. We heard evidence from Mr. York-Smith and Mr. Benford about that, and they both expressed the view that that was really an essential component of an agile and efficient response to an emergency. Do you agree with their view?
Oh, completely. When I was chief analyst in the DFE, I created the data science unit in DFE, and that would have been about 2014, 2015. So for Treasury not to have one by 2020 is pretty poor. So yes, if you want a gotcha moment, Treasury got something wrong, then that is your gotcha moment. But as James said, in the time that he was in the Treasury, we did create a data science unit. He's now left Treasury, I've left Treasury. I can't tell you if their current data science capability is sort of top of the civil service class, middle of the pack or bottom, but we know it has improved since then. And of course, in another 10, 20, 30 years, who knows what the new skill will be that will be needed in that pandemic. But clearly it's helpful for the analytical team in the Treasury to be up to date with modern analytical techniques.
Did you find, working in the Treasury at the time, that they weren't up to scratch, the analytical team, that they weren't up with the latest techniques, that was lacking, obviously?
So on data science, absolutely. More generally, not, no. Although, as I note in my evidence, there are, compared to, say, the Bank of England, the Treasury has far fewer people in economics who are trained to master's level or PhD level. And I think they should, again, benchmark themselves to other organisations and the Treasury in the past to think about whether that's appropriate. Master's courses in economics these days are hardcore number crunching courses where you learn proper up-to-date econometrics of the sort that somebody of my age is out of date, and that you will very rarely get at undergraduate level.
Right. Thank you. Dr. Loynick, those are my questions of you. I think there are some Rule 10 questions, my lady.
There are. Ms. Beattie, who sits there?
Dr. Loynick, I ask questions on behalf of National Disabled People's Organisations. In your statement, you say that it wouldn't have been sensible to suggest that disabled people should have been able to claim furlough as a right, because at the start of COVID, we had little evidence as to who was vulnerable, you say, and that therefore we wouldn't have had the knowledge base to say who should have had the right to furlough. Now, there were known increased costs faced and borne by disabled people, and foreseeable and recognised disproportionate adverse impacts of NPIs on disabled people, as well as a known pre-existing disability employment gap and disability pay gap. So given that existing knowledge base about disabled people and disabled workers, one didn't need more specific knowledge about specific clinical vulnerability to COVID itself to assess the importance of a right to furlough for disabled people. Would that be fair?
No, I don't think it would be. As you say, quite rightly, there are additional costs that people who are disabled face, but it will be very odd to say that those who get furloughed should get that additional money, but those who are not in work more generally should not. So those extra costs should be met in general through the standard welfare system that is universal and available to all people with disabilities at appropriate volumes for the disabilities that they have. So no, I think furlough would be a very odd way to do that.
And in terms then, though, of maintaining that link between workers and employers, which I think you've said in answer to
absolutely.
the council inquiry was, in your view, really the primary purpose of furlough. Given what we know about disability employment gap, difficulty of disabled workers having reasonable adjustments met and resulting disability pay gap, would you accept, though, that furlough is particularly important potentially for disabled workers if the aim is to maintain that link and, as you say, make sure that workers don't drop out of the labour market altogether?
Yes.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much, sweetie. Mr. Jacobs, who's over there?
Ah, yes.
Dr. Leunig, on behalf of the TUC, the arguably unhappy task of asking you about advanced planning for the next pandemic or civil emergency. You've described in evidence and in your statement, Kate Bell, having raised with you that many large employers have the 6-week notice period, and that was, in fact, the first time that the government had thought about the relationship between extension of furlough and notice periods. Do you not think that that's an example, but just one of many, of knowledge gained that needs to be built on and be available in the next pandemic?
So, to be clear, the TUC were the first people to tell me about it, but I think that I shared the email from either Kate or Rain with 93 members of staff congratulating us on the furlough scheme. So I can't speak for those 93. They may have known that as well. But I absolutely agree with you that the TUC was an excellent partner during the crisis, in the creation of the furlough scheme and otherwise. But to be honest, it worked. I mean, as Kate said, it was one of the best things we did. And there wasn't the need. I'm not saying we shouldn't have a tripartite system or whatever. I think that's a democratic issue for the democratically elected government of the day. But I think actually the furlough scheme proved that there is no pressing need to have those sort of formal tripartite systems, that when push comes to shove, the Treasury will ring the TUC will ring the Treasury, both sides are on the same thing, and knowledge and information gets through very, very quickly. Once you create a formal structure, you really can risk delaying things quite quickly. We managed it in 55 hours, and whilst I'm sure if I summoned Kate to a meeting at 10:30 p.m, she would accept, I think you would feel constrained about calling a tripartite meeting at some of the times we called meetings internally, and I think that would have risked it coming along so quickly.
There is certainly no resistance from the TUC on there having been a large measure of success, but in terms of how it was achieved, you've given it a sense of it just then in your evidence, but also in your statement, achieved by some very competent people, working extremely fast and extremely hard. You describe emails at 8 a.m. and after midnight, day after day. It doesn't sound an infallible approach to resistance, does it? The good fortune of good people working 18 hours a day.
Well, it's not
rather than doing what you can in advance to equip those responsible with the best knowledge that you can on how to respond with a furlough scheme and the like.
Well, I don't wish to sound adversarial here, but I think that really is a case of the pot calling the kettle black, because a couple of hours ago, Kate Bell told us she was working all hours of day and night, but I don't see the TUC turning around and saying, well, the way the TUC worked was terrible. Kate had to work at all hours of day and night, and it was just a lucky coincidence we had someone of her calibre. Both your organisation and HM Treasury are fine organisations that can and do consistently recruit good people. And I mean good in two senses. I mean both that they're capable, as Kate is, as I am, as Dan York-Smith is, and so on and so forth. And good people in that they're not people who say, oh, I'm sorry, it's 5:02, I've got to go home. These are people who are committed to public service in your organisation and mine, and I'm absolutely confident that if we had another crisis next year or in 10 years, the Treasury and the TUC and the CBI and 101 organisations, including many of the interested parties here, will step up again and they will work as hard as they are required in order to achieve the things we all went into public service for. They will not get overtime, they will not get recognition, but deep in their hearts they will know that is what they signed up to, and they will be proud of having delivered what they can for the people of our country.
Absolutely, and it's certainly not the premise of my question that planning and being good and working hard are somehow mutually exclusive. But you've spoken about the potential use of data and how improved data use can feed into job retention schemes. It can't be right, can it, just to wait for the next pandemic and then try and resolve the problem about how best to use data in the midst of the crisis. Isn't that an example of precisely the sort of thing that actually, from which there can be real benefit in planning?
Well, I've already said that I'm in favour of collecting more data in advance, subject to some cost-benefit analysis, and I've set out some of the limits to that. So I'm in favour of learning when people are made redundant and when they start work, but I'm not in favour of the government discovering who in your household buys the toothpaste, and I know nothing about your household arrangements, whether there's one or more people who buy toothpaste and what we can deduce about your living arrangements. That would be data too far. So yes, on data, especially as data gets easier and cheaper to collect, we should collect more data. That's standard cost-benefit analysis, and you'll find no disagreement between you and I there, I suspect.
Doctor, thank you very much. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jacobs. That completes the questions we have for you, Dr. Lunig. There are many unsung heroes of the pandemic, and I'm sure you and your colleagues were amongst them, so thank you for mentioning it. You all deserve our gratitude, I know, and thank you personally for your commitment to the inquiry. Your written statement is extraordinarily helpful, and please rest assured, I hope you have been, that we'll very much take that into account when reaching our findings. And I found your evidence this afternoon not only interesting, but on occasions entertaining, which I confess I hadn't expected.
Am I allowed to make a final statement?
Yes, you may.
Which is that I think it's important in all of this to remember that what we did cost a great deal of money. And I say that not just because I'm here as a Treasury witness, but to think about next time. We borrowed a lot of money, and I think it's really important that we as a nation discover why we needed to borrow so much more money than most European countries. Because our level of debt is now sufficiently high that it will get harder to borrow that sort of increment again. So of all the things I think the Treasury and the government need to do, that will be my #1 recommendation. Beyond that, as I've said, we can hire good people in government, but there is a limit to how many good people you can hire, particularly at the top, at the rates of pay that have, and I can say this now that I've left without trying to feather my own nest, at the very top of the civil service. And finally, as anybody who's ever worked with politicians will know, there are good politicians and less effective ones. And if we're serious about getting the best people to go into politics, it would be helpful, I think, if this inquiry were to call for a greater degree of respect for politicians who have to make some terrible choices sometimes while they're in government. Because if we continually pillory them, no good people will go into politics, and we as a society, as a whole, will suffer for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. That completes, I think, the evidence for today.
It does.
Very well. I shall return for 10 o'clock tomorrow.